The sun was nearly set behind the distant mountains of Liddesdale, when a few of the scattered and terrified inhabitants of the village of Herseldown, which had 4 days before been burned by a predatory band of English borderers, were now busied in repairing their ruined dwellings. One high tower in the center of the village alone exhibited no appearance of devastation. It was surrounded with court walls, and the outer gate was barred and bolted. The bushes and brambles which grew around, and had even insinuated their branches beneath the gate, plainly showed that it must have been many years since it had been opened. While the cottages around lay in smoking ruins, this pile, deserted and desolate as it seemed to be, had suffered nothing from the violence of the invaders, and the wretched beings who were endeavoring to repair their miserable huts against nightfall seemed to neglect the preferable shelter which it might have afforded them, without the necessity of labor. Before the day had quite gone down, a knight, richly armed, and mounted upon an ambling hackney, rode slowly into the village. His attendants were a lady, apparently young and beautiful, who rode by his side upon a dappled palfrey, his squire, who carried his helmet and lance, and led his battle horse, a noble steed, richly caparisoned. A page and 4 yeomen, bearing bows and quivers, short swords, and targets of a span breadth, completed his equipage, which, though small, denoted him to be a man of high rank. He stopped and addressed several of the inhabitants whom curiosity had withdrawn from their labor to gaze at him, but at the sound of his voice, and still more on perceiving the St. George's Cross in the caps of his followers, they fled, with a loud cry that the Southrons were returned. The knight endeavored to expostulate with the fugitives, who were chiefly aged men, women, and children, but their dread of the English name accelerated their flight, and in a few minutes, excepting the knight and his attendants, the place was deserted by all. He paced through the village to seek a shelter for the night, and despairing to find one either in the inaccessible tower or the plundered huts of the peasantry, he directed his course to the left hand, where he spied a small, decent habitation, apparently the abode of a man considerably above the common rank. After much knocking, the proprietor at length showed himself at the window, and speaking in the English dialect, with great signs of apprehension, demanded their business. The warrior replied that his quality was an English knight and baron, and that he was travelling to the court of the King of Scotland on affairs of consequence to both kingdoms. "Pardon my hesitation, noble Sir Knight," said the old man, as he unbolted and unbarred his doors. "Pardon my hesitation, but we are here exposed to too many intrusions to admit of our exercising unlimited and unsuspicious hospitality. What I have is yours, and God send your mission may bring back peace and the good days of our old Queen Margaret." "Amen, worthy Franklin," quoth the knight. "Did you know her?" "I came to this country in her train," said the Franklin, "and the care of some of her jointure lands, which she devolved on me, occasioned my settling here." "And how do you, being an Englishman," said the knight, "protect your life and property here, when one of your nation cannot obtain a single night's lodging, or a draught of water, were he thirsty?" "Marry, noble sir," answered the Franklin, "use, as they say, will make a man live in a lion's den, and as I settled here in a quiet time, and have never given cause of offense, I am respected by my neighbors, and even, as you see, by our forayers from England. I rejoice to hear it, and accept your hospitality. Isabella, my love, our worthy host will provide you a bed. My daughter, good Franklin, is ill at ease. We will occupy your house till the Scottish king shall return from his northern expedition. Meanwhile call me Lord Lacy of Chester." The attendants of the Baron, assisted by the Franklin, were now busied in disposing of the horses and arranging the table for some refreshment for Lord Lacy and his fair companion. While they sat down to it, they were attended by their host and his daughter, whom custom did not permit to eat in their presence, and who afterwards withdrew to an outer chamber, where the squire and page, both young men of noble birth, partook of supper, and were accommodated with beds. The yeoman, after doing honor to the rustic cheer of Queen Margaret's bailiff, withdrew to the stable, and each, beside his favorite horse, snored away the fatigues of their journey. Early on the following morning the travelers were roused by a thundering knocking at the door of the house, accompanied with many demands for instant admission, in the roughest tone. The squire and page of Lord Lacy, after buckling on their arms, were about to sally out to chastise these intruders, when the old host, after looking out at a private casement, contrived for reconnoitering his visitors, entreated them, with great signs of terror, to be quiet, if they did not mean that all in the house should be murdered. He then hastened to the apartment of Lord Lacy, whom he met dressed in a long furred gown and the knightly cap called a mortier, irritated at the noise, and demanding to know the cause which had disturbed the repose of the household. "Noble sir," said the franklin, "one of the most formidable and bloody of the Scottish border riders is at hand. He is never seen," added he, faltering with terror, "so far from the hills, but with some bad purpose, and the power of accomplishing it, so hold yourself to your guard, for—" A loud crash here announced that the door was broken down, and the knight just descended the stair in time to prevent bloodshed betwixt his attendants and the intruders. They were 3 in number. Their chief was tall, bony, and athletic. His spare and muscular frame, as well as the hardness of his features, marked the course of his life to have been fatiguing and perilous. The effect of his appearance was aggravated by his dress, which consisted of a jack, or jacket, composed of thick buff leather, on which small plates of iron of a lozenge form were stitched, in such a manner as to overlap each other and form a coat of mail, which swayed with every motion of the wearer's body. This defensive armor covered a doublet of coarse grey cloth, and the borderer had a few half-rusted plates of steel on his shoulders, a two-edged sword, with a dagger hanging beside it, in a buff belt, a helmet, with a few iron bars, to cover the face instead of a visor, and a lance of tremendous and uncommon length, completed his appointments. The looks of the man were as wild and rude as his attire. His keen black eyes never rested one moment fixed upon a single object, but constantly traversed all around, as if they ever sought some danger to oppose, some plunder to seize, or some insult to revenge. The latter seemed to be his present object, for, regardless of the dignified presence of Lord Lacy, he uttered the most incoherent threats against the owner of the house and his guests. "We shall see, aye, marry shall we, if an English hound is to harbour and reset the Southrons here. Thank the Abbot of Melrose and the good Knight of Coldingnoe that have so long kept me from your skirts. But those days are gone, by St. Mary, and you shall find it." It is probable the enraged borderer would not have long continued to vent his rage in empty menaces, had not the entrance of the 4 yeomen, with their bows bent, convinced him that the force was not at this moment on his own side. Lord Lacy now advanced towards him. "You intrude upon my privacy, soldier, withdraw yourself and your followers. There is peace betwixt our nations, or my servants should chastise thy presumption." "Such peace as ye give such shall you have," answered the moss trooper, first pointing with his lance towards the burned village, and then almost instantly levelling it against Lord Lacy. The squire drew his sword, and severed at one blow the steel head from the truncheon of the spear. "Arthur Fitzherbert," said the baron, "that stroke has deferred thy knighthood for 1 year. Never must that squire wear the spurs whose unbridled impetuosity can draw unbidden his sword in the presence of his master. Go hence, and think on what I have said." The squire left the chamber abashed. "It were vain," continued Lord Lacy, "to expect that courtesy from a mountain churl which even my own followers can forget. Yet before thou drawest thy brand, for the intruder laid his hand upon the hilt of his sword, thou wilt do well to reflect that I came with a safe conduct from thy king, and have no time to waste in brawls with such as thou." From my king," re-echoed the mountaineer. "I care not that rotten truncheon," striking the shattered spear furiously on the ground, "for the King of Fife and Lothian. But Habby of Cessford will be here believe, and we shall soon know if he will permit an English churl to occupy his hostelry." Having uttered these words, accompanied with a lowering glance from under his shaggy black eyebrows, he turned on his heel and left the house with his 2 followers. They mounted their horses, which they had tied to an outer fence, and vanished in an instant. "Who is this discourteous ruffian?" said Lord Lacy to the franklin, who had stood in the most violent agitation during this whole scene. "His name, noble lord, is Adam Kerr of the Moat, but he is commonly called by his companions the Black Rider of Cheviot." I fear, he comes hither for no good, but if the Lord of Cessford be near, he will not dare offer any unprovoked outrage. I have heard of that chief, said the Baron, let me know when he approaches. And do thou, Rodolph, to the eldest yeoman, keep a strict watch. Adalbert, to the page, attend to arm me. The page bowed, and the Baron withdrew to the chamber of the Lady Isabella, to explain the cause of the disturbance. No more of the proposed tale was ever written, but the author's purpose was that it should turn upon a fine legend of superstition which is current in the part of the borders where he had his residence, where, in the reign of Alexander III of Scotland, that renowned person, Thomas of Hersildown, called the Rhymer, actually flourished. This personage, the Merlin of Scotland, and to whom some of the adventures which the British bards assigned to Merlin Caledonius, or the Wild, have been transferred by tradition, was, as is well known, a magician, as well as a poet and prophet. He is alleged still to live in the land of Faerie, and is expected to return at some great convulsion of society, in which he is to act a distinguished part, a tradition common to all nations, as the belief of the Mohammedans respecting their 12th Imam demonstrates. Now, it chanced many years since that there lived on the borders a jolly, rattling horse-cooper, who was remarkable for a reckless and fearless temper, which made him much admired, and a little dreaded, amongst his neighbours. One moonlight night, as he rode over Bowden Moor, on the west side of the Eildon Hills, the scene of Thomas the Rhymer's prophecies, and often mentioned in his story, having a brace of horses along with him which he had not been able to dispose of, he met a man of venerable appearance and singularly antique dress, who, to his great surprise, asked the price of his horses, and began to chaffer with him on the subject. To Cannaby Dick, for so shall we call our border dealer, a chap was a chap, and he would have sold a liaise to the devil himself, without minding his cloven hoof, and would have probably cheated old Nick into the bargain. The stranger paid the price they agreed on, and all that puzzled Dick in the transaction was that the gild which he received was in unicorns, bonnet pieces, and other ancient coins, which would have been invaluable to collectors, but were rather troublesome in modern currency. It was gold, however, and therefore Dick contrived to get better value for the coin than he perhaps gave to his customer. By the command of so good a merchant, he brought horses to the same slot more than once, the purchaser only stipulating that he should always come by night, and alone. I do not know whether it was from mere curiosity, or whether some hope of gain mixed with it, but after Dick had sold several horses in this way, he began to complain that dry bargains were unlucky, and to hint that since his chap must live in the neighbourhood, he ought, in the courtesy of dealing, to treat him to half a mutchkin. You may see my dwelling if you will, said the stranger, but if you lose courage at what you see there, you will rue it all your life. Dickon, however, laughed the warning to scorn, and having alighted to secure his horse, he followed the stranger up a narrow footpath, which led them up the hills to the singular eminence stuck betwixt the most southern and the centre peaks, and called, from its resemblance to such an animal in its form, the Lucken Hare. At the foot of this eminence, which is almost as famous for witch meetings as the neighbouring windmill of Kippilaw, Dick was somewhat startled to observe that his conductor entered the hillside by a passage or cavern, of which he himself, though well acquainted with the spot, had never seen or heard. You may still return, said his guide, looking ominously back upon him, but Dick scorned to show the white feather, and on they went. They entered a very long range of stables. In every stall stood a coal-black horse, by every horse lay a knight in coal-black armour, with a drawn sword in his hand, but all were as silent, hoof and limb, as if they had been cut out of marble. A great number of torches lent a gloomy lustre to the hall, which, like those of the Caliph Vathek, was of large dimensions. At the upper end, however, they at length arrived, where a sword and horn lay on an antique table. He that shall sound that horn and draw that sword, said the stranger, who now intimated that he was the famous Thomas of Hersildown, shall, if his heart fail him not, be king over all broad Britain. So speaks the tongue that cannot lie. But all depends on courage, and much on your taking the sword or the horn first. Dick was much disposed to take the sword, but his bold spirit was quailed by the supernatural terrors of the hall, and he thought to unsheath the sword first, might be construed into defiance, and give offence to the powers of the mountain. He took the bugle with a trembling hand, and a feeble note, but loud enough to produce a terrible answer. Thunder rolled in stunning peals through the immense hall, horses and men started to life, the steeds snorted, stamped, grinned their bits, and tossed on high their heads, the warriors sprung to their feet, clashed their armor, and brandished their swords. Dick's terror was extreme at seeing the whole army, which had been so lately silent as the grave, in uproar, and about to rush on him. He dropped the horn, and made a feeble attempt to seize the enchanted sword, but at the same moment a voice pronounced aloud the mysterious words, "Woe to the coward, that ever he was born, who did not draw the sword before he blew the horn." At the same time a whirlwind of irresistible fury howled through the long hall, bore the unfortunate horse-jockey clear out of the mouth of the cavern, and precipitated him over a steep bank of loose stones, where the shepherds found him the next morning with just breath sufficient to tell his fearful tale, after concluding which he expired. This legend, with several variations, is found in many parts of Scotland and England. The scene is sometimes laid in some favourite glen of the Highlands, sometimes in the deep coal mines of Northumberland and Cumberland, which rim so far beneath the ocean. It is also to be found in Reginald Scott's book on witchcraft, which was written in the 16th century. It would be in vain to ask what was the original of the tradition. The choice between the horn and sword may, perhaps, include as a moral that it is foolhardy to awaken danger before we have arms in our hands to resist it. Although admitting of much poetical ornament, it is clear that this legend would have formed but an unhappy foundation for a prose story, and must have degenerated into a mere fairy tale. Dr. John Lydon has beautifully introduced the tradition in his Scenes of Infancy. Mysterious rhymer, doomed by fate's decree still to revisit Eildon's fated tree, or off the Swain, at dawn of Hallowday, here's thy fleet barb with wild impatience nay, say, who is he, with summons long and high, shall bid the charmed sleep of ages fly, roll the long sound through Eildon's caverns vast, while each dark warrior kindles at the blast, the horn, the falchion, grasp with mighty hand, and peal proud Arthur's march from fairyland? Asterisk. Scenes of Infancy, Part 1. In the same cabinet with the preceding fragment, the following occurred among other disjecta membra. It seems to be an attempt at a tale of a different description from the last, but was almost instantly abandoned. The introduction points out the time of the composition to have been about the end of the 18th century.